Hi, I'm Amy Edwards, and welcome to the Edwards Table. This podcast is all about real conversations, the kind that come from life, love, family, friendship, and all the messy, beautiful parts in between. I started this show because I believe in redemption stories and in sitting down together to talk about the things that shape us, heal us, and sometimes just make us laugh. So grab a seat, take a breath, and join me, because there's always room for you here at the Edwards Table. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Edwards Table. My name is Amy Edwards, and I am delighted to be your host here on the podcast. And if you are watching this episode on our YouTube channel, welcome to my kitchen. This is where we are today. For those of you listening, I am actually at my bar top and have some ingredients over my right shoulder and my mixer behind me. Actually getting ready to jump in there and make some yummy things. But in the meantime, wanted to pop on and just have a little chat for this week's episode. If you've been joining us regularly, you heard last week when I was sharing kind of vision of what 2026 was going to look like, that I am actually going to be in my kitchen a lot more. This is just kind of my spot to go to, if you will. I really enjoy being in my kitchen. Love working with my hands, love making delicious food, and I have a ton of stories around all kinds of recipes. So it's kind of fun. I'm going to get to talk to you about some fun things maybe that happened when I was learning how to cook a certain recipe or got a recipe or whatever, and you'll just get to know me that much more. If you are new here, definitely would appreciate a subscribe, a like, a comment, all the things. Really appreciate all of those. And you can always catch us on anywhere social media. So it's at the Edwards Table. There might be an underscore in between words, I think, on our social media. But yeah, we're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the places. So definitely come give us a follow. You'll see some more behind the scenes over there that you don't necessarily get here on the podcast. So today, I'm actually, honestly, getting ready to make a recipe. I've pulled all the ingredients, and if you want the recipe, I'll say this at the end as well, but if you want this recipe, I'm going to share that over on our YouTube channel as well as over on all of our social media channels. There'll be a link there as well with a quick little video, the instructions, and all of the things. But I come to you today bearing gifts of this awesome cookbook, which is the Red and White Better Homes and Gardens. This is actually my very first cookbook that I ever got when I became a wife. So when John and I got married, this was my very first cookbook. And I don't know about you all, but if you're in my age bracket, more than likely your moms had this cookbook, your grandmas had this cookbook, and they put a new version out very regularly. So this one is from the actual year that I was married, which was 1997. And the reason why I pulled my cookbook out today is my grandmother, I had said this last episode, wanted to give her a big nod today. She passed away a few years back, but she was someone that I have always viewed as one of my heroes. She's someone who went against the times that she lived in, and I don't mean like she was some famous person you would know, but like, for instance, she wasn't a traditional stay-at-home mom. Like, she worked a full-time job raising my mom and my uncle, and she was married, but she was not a traditional stay-at-home mom, and she worked for as long as I can remember. She was working until she couldn't. But when I was a little girl, she had the coolest job. At least I think it was the coolest job. She was a telephone operator. And for all of you younglings out there, let me just fill you in. So way back when, you didn't have a direct line to someone necessarily. So you would pick up your phone and you would talk to an operator, and that operator would then connect your call to the person you were trying to telephone. Well, then years later, telephone operators actually would work for answering services, which is what my grandmother did when I was a little girl. And what that was when you would call like to a business or to someone's home, if they paid for this service, then you'd be put in touch with a telephone operator, and that person would either take a message and pass it on to the person you were trying to reach, or they would actually take a cable and they would plug it into their switchboard. And if you don't know what a switchboard is, Google it. It's super cool. So as a little girl, I would go to work with my grandma when I would stay with her and my grandfather during the summers. And she worked for a lady who owned a answering service. And so my grandmother and a couple other ladies worked there. And y'all, it was so much fun. Obviously, this was well before we had iPhones and screen time and all of the things. And so I would go and spend the day with my grandmother as she would work. And the lady she worked for actually had this business in her home. And so she had 2 little black toy poodles that would come, and I got to play with them. There was a chair that wasn't being used, and so it was an office chair, and it spun, and I would spin for who knows how many minutes at a time, and my grandmother would usually have to make me stop because it would make her ill watching. But I used to be enamored with it, and there was a switchboard that wasn't in use, so I got to play with that and like plug cables in and pretend like I was an operator. It was a ton of fun. It was so much fun. But one of the things that my grandmother and I did together, not a lot of, but we did do some, was we would go into her kitchen and we would make things together. And one of the things that my grandmother, I remember of hers, she had a couple of recipes that I still make to this day, but one was her cinnamon rolls. And I told you she was not like the average woman of her time. So she was very, I guess, forward thinking, if you will. And she wouldn't home make her bread dough for her cinnamon rolls. She actually found that you could buy frozen loaves of bread. And so she would buy frozen loaves of white bread, and then she would thaw it out, roll it out, put cinnamon, sugar, butter, nuts if you want them, roll them up, cut them, and then bake them. And so one of the things that I do and became a tradition in our family is I home make cinnamon rolls at Christmas time. And I've done this since John and I got married. Like I've done it every year. And initially, when I first started learning how to be in the kitchen, because I definitely was not someone who could, that is what I did. I bought the frozen dough and would roll it out and do it like my grandma did. But then as time went on, I really started realizing how much I knew I loved being in the kitchen, and I wanted to learn how to do like home cooked things, homemade things, not necessarily out of a package, but from scratch. And so I literally, like this cookbook, this Better Homes and Gardens cookbook, the red and white one, I used it because like in the back of it has tips and tricks and substitutions and measurements and things like that. So when I first got married, we didn't have access to Google, like you couldn't call on Siri to come and answer all your questions or type into ChatGPT, or really you can talk to it too, but like you didn't have all of those things where you could go and get tips and tricks, or go onto YouTube and watch a quick short on it, or follow your favorite influencer on TikTok. And so for me, this cookbook, really and truly, it was more than just recipes. It was really like a guide for everything that I was trying to learn how to do. So this was kind of my starting point, and then some great memories of my childhood. And so like I was talking about with my grandmother, so I would spend my summers with she and my grandfather, and then I would stay with other family and friends while I was up in Indiana. And I stayed most of the summer, usually about 6 weeks, because my mom worked multiple jobs and was single mom when I was younger. And so for me to be at home just didn't make sense. And so going up and staying with my grandma and grandpa, it was just the best. Holidays, cinnamon rolls were definitely the thing. And so today's recipe that will be attached to this episode actually will be my cinnamon rolls that I make, and they will be from scratch. But if you're intimidated by that, don't worry. You can substitute in the bread dough if you can find it in your freezer section at the grocery, which I don't know why, but here out in Texas, where we're located anyway, they've stopped carrying it, which is a little sad. But all this to say, I loved spending all of this time with my grandma, and her kitchen was a sacred spot. She had a little inlet on one end of her kitchen, just big enough for a table for 2 people, and it was a little round table that she kept there and 2 chairs. And then all she had was a standing or a slide-in good heavens, stove and oven range that just slid in with one little wee set of cabinets there, and then you turned and there was a sink, and then you turned again and there was a refrigerator. So there wasn't a ton of space in her kitchen, but she had a spot where I could sit up on the counter, and I loved that. That was one of my favorite things to get to do, and that was very special to sit on the countertop there. And then, she had a drawer stack next to her refrigerator down below in her cabinets, and there in the second drawer down were always the bread options. So I come from a Midwestern family, and bread was part of everything that we ate. My grandpa always had bread and butter with his meal at night. No matter what we ate, he always had bread and butter. And so knowing that that's where the stash was, I could go in and get a piece of bread anytime I wanted, and don't you fret, I did often. But another thing was, when I was really little, my grandma and grandpa had this wallpaper. And if you are in my age group and probably older, it was very common. It was like these great big flowers, and they were in the 3 like popular colors of the 60s and 70s, which is this unbelievably wild shade of split pea green. So you can just let that run with your imagination. And then there was a rust and a what I would call goldenrod. If you're not familiar, I'm telling you, just Google it. But they had this wallpaper in their kitchen, and which was nice because obviously I was a little girl going in there making huge messes. And so my grandmother, though, was hilarious. She would let me try things that I hadn't done before. So for instance, one summer, we decided that the recipe we were going to make was instant pudding. So like I said, my grandmother, not like a scratch cook at all. We were not doing anything too wild, but putting a hand mixer in a 7-year-old's hands, I'm just going to say all the blessings to you as you try that. So needless to say, we got all the ingredients. She gave me permission to use the mixer. And she was standing with me while I was up on the counter, and I set the mixer down in it and turned it on high, and everything shot out of the bowl, was shooting out of the bowl. I panicked and picked up the mixer. There was chocolate pudding, I mean, literally in every nook and cranny of that kitchen. There was not a spot that was not covered in spatters of chocolate pudding. On the ceiling, the floor, all over the counter, underneath the cabinets, on the cabinets, down the cabinets, all over my grandmother. And my grandmother always wore glasses, and it was just, she had spatterings all over her glasses, her face. It was in her hair. Oh, and y'all, back in the day, our grandmothers used to go every Saturday morning to the beauty shop and get their hair wet set, sometimes permed, teased, combed, and then they would sleep on rollers during the week to keep their hair fresh for the week, if you will. So it was a big deal. You didn't get your grandma's hair wet, sweaty, or messy. You just didn't touch women's hair at all. And yeah, we had chocolate pudding all up in Grandma's stew that day. So needless to say, she and I were laughing so hard that we didn't immediately turn the mixer off. I think she unplugged it. And just about that time, my grandfather came into the room, mortified, obviously, but seeing literally pudding dripping off of the ceiling onto the floor and whatever else. And he was like, what is going on in here? And my grandmother had gotten so tickled. She was laughing so hard, she could not get her words out. And that pretty much sent my grandfather out of the room. He just shook his head and turned around and left. And so she and I got everything taken care of. I'm confident I didn't do quite as much help in the cleanup as she actually did. But I remember her having to stand up on the counter to reach the ceiling. She was a wee little person. She was just at 5 feet tall. And so she had to stand on the counter in order to reach the ceiling or whatever. And so she was cleaning it off and got it off the ceiling, got it off the cabinets, off of she and I, we got all cleaned up or whatever. But from that day forward until, let's see, I think I was like 6 or 7 when that happened. And that wallpaper stayed up until I was in high school. And there was this one little spot underneath the cabinets that had wallpaper, and there was a little spattering of pudding that was still there. And I remember many summers later, I went back up to visit, and I obviously was much taller, so I could see from the ground what was under there, and I realized it was there. And I told my grandma, I said, "Oh, Grandma, oh my goodness, I see pudding from when we made pudding that time." I said, "Do you want me to clean it off?" And she said, "Oh, no, dear, don't clean that off. Grandpa likes having your pudding on his wallpaper." And so it always warmed my heart when I thought about that was one of their memories of me. And assure yourself, in the moment, my grandfather was anything but impressed. When he had to walk out of the room, you knew he was very flustered. But I always thought that so sweet that he wanted to keep the pudding underneath his cabinets just as a reminder of the day that I tried to make pudding. On a good note, I did learn how to make pudding without slinging it all over the kitchen. But while my grandmother was still here, we had some good laughs over that story because I made an absolute disaster out of that poor kitchen. And thankfully it wasn't a big kitchen because, I can only imagine how far all of it would have shot had we had more space to go in. But those kinds of memories with my grandmother and grandfather, but mainly my grandma was the one who would let me come in the kitchen with her and kind of putt around and whatnot. Another unique thing too about my grandma and grandpa's marriage, which is kind of interesting because John and I are very much the same, is that she and my grandpa really and truly tag teamed, like cooking and cleaning. My grandpa, I remember many times would cook part of the meal and my grandmother would cook the other part, or he would cook the whole meal even, depending on what we were having. So for instance, if we were doing her famous fried chicken and smashed potatoes, he would peel and boil and make the potatoes, and my grandmother would fry the chicken. So they kind of did that, which I thought was really cool, but I think a little more unique. I don't know of a lot of fellas that were in the kitchen with their wives in that generation as much, until maybe they got older. And so we would do a lot of those things all together, the three of us, where we would all jump in the kitchen and they'd give me a job. They'd give me something to do. And then they would, get our meal prepped and ready to go. And it's so funny too, because I think about like back in my childhood, how very simple of a time that really was and how simple our meals were. And not because, my grandparents weren't well-to-do. They were a blue-collar family, meaning that my grandfather was a master weldsman, so he welded for a factory there in Indiana. And, like I told you, my grandmother was a telephone operator. And then when that business closed down, she worked in a department store. So, like, they were not a well-to-do family by any stretch of the imagination, but we always had really good meals. And we would have, up in Indiana in the summertime, you get amazing fresh fruits and vegetables. And so, it was very common for us to have a meal with meat, usually a canned veggie, and then like some sliced cantaloupe and some sliced tomatoes. And that would be our dinner. And it was delicious and I love it. And I actually love eating that way. Almost like tapas, but not quite so fancy. But it was such a simple meal and simply done. And that's just kind of how they cooked, how they lived. And I loved that. I loved being able to sit down. So they did have a dining area. They had a dining room. And that's where we would eat our meals together. And what we would do, obviously, they were working during the day, so we only had dinner together at night. But we would sit down and we would have great conversations. Our meal would usually last a good while. So we would eat dinner, but we would talk along the way. So dinner didn't go really speedy fast. And then every night after dinner, we would clean up. My grandparents did not have a dishwasher, and so we would hand wash and dry and put away dishes. And the older I got, the more I did. So as I got older, I became more responsible for those things as well. But even when I was little, they'd give me a towel and let me dry the glasses or the dishes or whatever. So we would all clean up together. It was a team effort. And then I would go take my bath and then come back downstairs and we would play a game. And so from the time I can remember, we played games. It didn't matter how much I really understood it or not, but we played. And the older I got, the more involved the games became. So playing cards was a really big deal for my grandparents. They played with some of our family members who lived locally. Like they would get together regularly and play a game called euchre. There is not enough time for me to explain this to you, but it is a card game. You can indeed Google it, and it is actually very fun. You play with partners. It can get really funny fast, depending on how your partners are. About my grandma and grandpa, my grandfather was very competitive and very vocal about the fact that he wanted to win. My grandmother, honestly, I think she wanted to win, but she would get so tickled and start laughing and giggling, which then would frustrate my grandfather, and then they couldn't really be partners. It was best if they had other partners. So, but it was a lot of fun, like when my great aunts and uncles would come over and everybody would come around the table and play cards. And have something to snack on or after a meal or whatever. So those were my summers with my grandma and grandpa. We did some of the coolest stuff too. And what's so funny is as an adult, right? I'm a mom of 2 kids, and I look back at the times that I spent with my grandma and grandpa, and it mirrors very much what my children love about their childhood. So for instance, my grandma and grandpa, every summer we would go up to Michigan, and I think that's where the little farm was that we went. And we went strawberry picking. We picked strawberries every year. And my grandfather is so funny. He was a very particular person. So he had a way that he wanted you to pick the strawberries. He had a certain kind of color and the feel and everything. And from the time I can remember, when I was really little even, he was teaching me how to do it. And not always was he the gentlest of souls. He could be a little bit rough around the edges. But with me, he tended to be very patient and cognizant that I was still just a little girl. And it was very common. He too wore glasses. It was very common for him to get a little frazzled with me and look over his glasses. And he would call me, my nickname was Babes. And he would say, "Babes, that's not the way that we pick those strawberries. Show me how we pick them." So if I twisted it off, he always fussed at me. You had to snap it off and hold the stem and hold the strawberry at the same time, and do it just so and whatnot. And when I wouldn't do it, sometimes I would do it just to get a rise out of him. And he would know the difference, obviously. But he was always very patient with me, even though I, even at a young age, knew that he would get frazzled and frustrated because, you're paying for strawberries by the pound that you're picking. And when I'm bringing back 6 that are white instead of red, you don't want to pay for that. So lots of really good memories with my grandma and grandpa. And I think another one that I thought about when I was sitting down for today, and why I am who I am today, right? Why do I love being in my kitchen? So I told you I spent my summers with my grandma and grandpa, and I would fly as an unaccompanied minor up to Indiana, and then my grandma would fly back to Memphis with me, and then she would stay with me and my mom for a week or 2 before she would go back home. And when my grandma would come for visits, either bringing me home or like another time during the year, if she would come and visit my mom and I, she would come with 2 coffee cans in her suitcase. And this I will never forget, and I think is literally the coolest thing ever. Even as a kid, I thought this was just the neatest. But when she would open the coffee cans, and when I say coffee cans, I don't know because I don't drink coffee that way. I just buy it whole beans, so it always comes in a bag. But way back in the day, you could buy these cans that were, I'm holding my hands up, they were probably like, I don't know, was that 8 inches maybe tall? And maybe another 6 wide, like great big cans. I don't even know how many ounces. I would guess maybe a 32-ounce can, like great big. Think about what you see in like a cafeteria, you know, the great big cans that they use. So coffee comes, I think it still does, in those cans. And my grandma would save her coffee cans and she would bake bread in them, sweet breads, not like sandwich loaves, but she would make 1 can of nut bread and 1 can of banana bread. I was not a huge fan of her nut bread, only because it was not as sweet as her banana bread. It was, I don't know how to explain it. It was like banana bread without the bananas in it. And she loved walnuts. And I'm sorry, like, those are just not my favorite nut, especially as a child. I'll eat them, but they're not my favorite. I prefer pecans in bread like that. And so she would bring the nut bread and then she would bring banana bread. And oh my goodness, the banana bread I loved. And the other thing I vividly remember about her is, so during that time, margarine was a big deal. You didn't, you know, a lot of people didn't use butter per se. A lot of people used margarine. And my grandmother, y'all, I think that woman put like a half of a stick on her little wee piece of bread because she liked a bite of the margarine with her bread, is what she said, which I found disgusting. But today, I probably would do that with regular butter because I love butter on my bread. But so yeah, so she would come, and I used to love it because she had a hard cased suitcase that was like that goldenrod, mustardy yellow kind of a color. And then she had a square case, and that was her overnight essentials. I can still remember the sound of her suitcase latches. Like when you pushed them, they clicked and they popped up, and then you opened them, and then the suitcase would open. And I loved it. I loved when my grandma would come because we would come back to the apartment, and she always slept in my bedroom, and I would sleep in the sleeping bag on the floor next to her. And she would open her suitcase and she would let me rifle through and find the cans. And so I would find the banana bread and the nut bread and bring them out to the kitchen. And some of the sweetest conversations we would have over those breads. We typically ate them for breakfast in the morning. Occasionally we might have a bite of it during the day, but typically we saved it for breakfast time. And just some of the most awesome, like I said, sweetest conversations over a piece of banana bread and her coffee in the morning. That didn't start for me until college, but I loved that. I loved her banana bread and just all of the nostalgia that went with it. Her visits and our conversations and the time we spent together. It was just such a beautiful, beautiful set of memories for me. And I think that's a big part of why I love being in the kitchen, is I love creating really cool memories. I love good conversations and stories and things of that nature. And my grandma was someone who taught me so much more. I mean, there was so much more to her and our story together. Her weekly letters that she would write and send to me. I always got a handwritten letter from her. And it wasn't that she was telling me anything wild or crazy, but there were things that I knew about, right? Like her library, for instance, because that was one of the things we did when I stayed with her, was we went to the library every week, and I got to check out 12 books every week and take them back and trade them out for 12 more the next. And I did that. I love reading because of her. I love the written word because of her. She taught me a bit about storytelling even then, in her letter writing and her conversations that she had with me. And then she also taught me, which I didn't really realize this until much later in my life, but she taught me how much I can be okay with being me, and be okay with being on my own. I think because my grandfather passed away when I was a freshman in college. And by that time in my life, my time with my grandma and grandpa, I really didn't get to spend much time with them anymore because my summers, I played sports and did theater and all of that. So my summers were jam-packed with all my activities, starting in high school. So my time with them really slowed down. And yet I still got those letters every week from my grandma. So she would tell me, I don't know, anything you can imagine about their day-to-day lives, about what was going on with my grandpa or her, or all of my aunts and uncles that were her brothers and sisters, right? My cousin and uncle and what was going on in their lives. And then the other cool thing too about where they lived was there were neighbors that all of them had been living in the same houses for, 30, 40, 50 years and knew one another. And so I knew the people on both sides of their house, 2 doors down from their house, across the street from their house. And so my grandma would when she would write to me, she would give me, little bits about what was going on with them and whatnot. It was so precious. I wish I realized how valuable it was. At the time in my life, I appreciated it, very much appreciated it, but also didn't have the value of just how precious that was, because you never know how long your loved ones will be on the planet and how long those memories are going to last. But from the time I can remember until I was, probably almost to college, my grandmother wrote me every week. And I think one of the saddest things for me, I was always hopeful for, was that I would get, my grandma's recipes and things. And unfortunately, they got lost in the shuffle over the years and whatnot. But I make it a point to give her a nod as often as I can. Both she and my grandfather, integral parts of my story and parts of my life. And I'm very appreciative of the legacy that I get to carry on because of the two of them, what they both have instilled in me, and then what I get to carry on and hopefully have taught well to my children, so that they one day teach their children the same things, right? But the value of just loving one another and connecting with one another in unique ways is so beautiful. Golly, it makes me miss my grandma. I know reality is, people can't live forever, and she lived until she was 86. But I'm so appreciative. And I think coming into this new year, and just kind of thinking about, what I'm focusing on and things of that nature, is kind of hearing her voice when I start to get really rough with myself. I know I made mention of this in the last episode, but just talking about this year, I really want to focus on loving myself better, and in a multitude of ways, but one in particular is how I speak to myself. Like, being such a hard critic and just brutal to myself. I think there's a time and a place for being super transparent and very upfront. And I think that should be done in love and not out of anger, disgust, frustration, whatever, which is where I've kind of been living with myself lately. And so one of the things I was thinking about for this year is just when I start getting that way, when I start getting really nasty with myself because I'm frustrated, I don't know, because let's say I wasn't active for the day or whatever, like I didn't walk or do something active, which I know I need. Instead of going straight to how disgusting and gross and ugly and nasty I feel and all the things, is today may not have been your best day, but we're going to try again tomorrow. And I think just listening to myself speak to me in my grandma's voice, because she would always say things honestly. She was not someone who sugarcoated the truth, but she also had a gentleness in how she would give it to me. And she could talk to me in a way that very few people have ever been able to, because I am so guarded and protective of myself. I tend to be a loving porcupine, if you will. And so that is whose voice I try to speak to myself in, is thinking about how my grandma would say it. And she would say what is truth and what needs to be said, but she would say it kindly and in a loving way. And that is hopefully my takeaway in terms of what I want to be able to take with me from her this year and really enjoy our time together, even though she's not with me anymore. I love my grandma. She's a pretty amazing human being. So yeah, if you are still with me into this episode, I thank you for being here with me today. And definitely, if you want to see my grandma, I've got some fun pictures of her that will go up on social media as well. So be sure to tune in there. And always, y'all, always, please remember this. There's always a seat here for you at this table. I am so thankful for this community. I'm so thankful that my story can impact others. And I'm here to tell it. And also, I'm here to cook some of it too. So y'all come back and join me again next week. I'm here every Wednesday with a new episode and maybe even a new recipe. I don't know. I think my family will be sad if I am cooking all kinds of sweet treats because, like I said, these are cinnamon rolls behind me. We don't necessarily need all of that in our lives right now as we're trying to get back on the healthy track for the year. So I don't know, but y'all stay tuned. Come back and see me again soon. Until then, remember, always a seat for you here, and you're not alone in this wild journey we call life. Take care, y'all. We'll see you next time.